Hello, scholars. Mr. Long here signing on. Today, I'm going to be hitting some of the highlights from Chapter 4 in the textbook in regards to colonial life, at least for the better part of the 17th century here in the New World. So, right off the bat, the average life for a colonist in the beginning of the English colony is pretty miserable. It sucked. Most people died all the time, and usually pretty quickly. The Europeans were highly susceptible to a litany of diseases, such as malaria, dysentery, and typhoid, that are going to be killing off the newcomers from England. Half of the people born in early Virginia and Maryland did not survive to the age of 20. So, for those of you that are in my class as juniors, some of you have already outlived many of the colonists here in the New World. Few of the remaining are going to live to see 50 years old, so there is a very high mortality rate with people dropping left and right. And we already saw some of that with Jamestown. Jamestown dealt more with starvation and lack of efficient preparation, but diseases still are going to do a number on the colonists. We also have ongoing conflicts with the Native Americans. That's also going to be a cause of a lot of these deaths as well. It's a very violent and very disgusting time to be alive, or to be dying, rather. There was low growth initially. The population took a while to really get going in any real way. The high mortality rate left settlements relying on immigrants to grow because they weren't able to reproduce naturally. A couple different reasons for that. First one is math. Most immigrants were young single males. And I don't know if any of you have taken biology yet, but you need to have more than one single male to reproduce. And unfortunately for the early colonists, men outnumbered women 6-1. Single women that did come to the colonies typically did not remain single, and it was pretty rare for a single woman to travel on her own or even with her family to the New World. More often than not, this was a young woman who was already married to someone, and maybe that guy dies off early on and she can remarry to reproduce and add to the population. But other than that, they're going to have a hard time keeping their numbers up. Eventually, native borns in the New World are going to develop resistance and immunities to these diseases. As the colonies become more civilized and more settled, more women are going to be able to come over or want to come over. And that's something I didn't mention before, that part of the reason you have so many more men than women was that colonizing the New World was difficult, arduous labor that, with the misogyny of the time, sexism of the time, people didn't see women as capable of doing that kind of work. So it was typically just men coming over. But over time, as things get developed, as the towns start to get bigger and more well-known and more respectable, women are coming over and adding to the population. At the beginning of the 18th century, that's right around 1700, Virginia had 59,000 people. And if you look at the chart over here, the graph over here kind of has a pretty nice, see the beginning of a bell curve in regards to the total population, where if we're looking at the beginning of the colonies, or at least when they started keeping track, by the time we get to the beginning of the 18th century here, we have a pretty substantial growth. And it's still not going to quite take off the way it does over the 200 years, because history is very slow, it's very methodical, it takes a lot of time, but we're starting to get there. Let's talk about the economy. If you recall from the lesson on Jamestown, tobacco is going to be the cash crop that enables the settlers to really make it work in Virginia. Tobacco is more profitable than corn. Many farmers are going to begin planting tobacco instead of corn or before corn. And tobacco ultimately is worse for the soil. It's pretty draining. It takes a lot of nutrients from the soil. And so you can't plant tobacco year after year after year after year in the same lot without giving it time to rest and replenish the nutrients. So as the farmers are consuming and destroying the soil with their tobacco crops, the only way that they can get more land and good land for their tobacco is to push further inland and take more land for themselves. this is going to begin a cycle provoking Native American attacks and conflicts with the Native Americans, because as the colonists push further inland to grow tobacco, they run up against Native Americans who are trying to defend their own land rights, and there's going to be conflict. Maybe the colonists win, maybe they don't, but if the colonists win, they'll stay there for a couple years, use up the soil, and then push further inland, starting another cycle of violence. And this is going to go on for far, far, far too long. Over the 17th century, the tobacco economy is going to boom. It's going to go from 1.5 million pounds of tobacco in 1630 to 40 million pounds of tobacco in 1700. For those of you that have taken economics, you might see this as a they're starting to, I'm blanking on the term, but there's too much tobacco, and as there's too much of any good, the price of it starts to drop because it's easy to get. And with 40 millions of tobacco going out in the world, prices aren't what they used to be because it's a lot easier to get it. So why would I pay an arm and a leg to get something that isn't that hard to get? So as the prices drop, farmers have to plant more crops of tobacco to make up for that drop in prices, which means, again, taking more land. And they also need more labor to work that land. And with the aforementioned low population in the colonies, at least for the better part of this 17th century, the issue of where to get labor is going to be a hot topic for the elites. So where do the colonists get more labor? Families are taking too long to procreate. Even if you do manage to get a young couple to have a child, it's going to be years and years and years before that child is ready to work in the field. So that's a pretty long con there. Natives have this pesky habit of dying from European diseases because the Europeans did go out and they did try to capture Native Americans, bring them back to their settlements to grow tobacco there for them, kind of like a slave labor. But either the Native Americans would die from European diseases, happened a lot, smallpox, or they would run away, and since they know the languages of the people, they know the geography of the people, it's a lot easier for them to escape and evade the Europeans to make it really not worthwhile for the Europeans to enslave the Native Americans. African slaves at this point are far too expensive for a large labor force. Yeah, maybe a few people can afford them. We have the first slaves coming over in 1619. And so a few people can afford them, but not the average tobacco farmer who's just trying to get by. Maybe the plantation elites, maybe they can afford it, but not the average person. So that's going to give us a nifty thing called indentured servants. So indentured servants, these are contracted laborers. These are usually gutter trash or unemployed people in England or Europe who are looking for a new life and economic opportunities. And so they're going to sign a contract with a wealthy individual who can pay for their boat ride over to the New World. So the one party, the person hiring the indentured servant, they pay for the boat ride, they feed the servant, they provide room and board. And in return for these services, the contracted indentured servant owes the contractor so many years for labor. Sometimes these were skilled laborers like blacksmiths or artisans, and they would have an easier time. Sometimes it was just like, hey, the only service you can offer me is manual labor because you don't know any trades and you're not very well educated, so I'm just going to put you to work picking tobacco. It doesn't take a lot of skill to do that, so you come on over, we'll make this work. At the end of the contract, which usually lasted a couple years, let's say 6 years average or so, the indentured servant would be released from their contract, their debt was considered paid, and the indentured servant would receive freedom dues. At least this was the like the tradition. This was kind of what the norm was early on, that the indentured servant, when they were freed, they would get stuff like an axe, a hoe, a few barrels of corn, suit of clothes, and perhaps even a small parcel of land for themselves to live on and farm. And so this was this was the contractor saying, all right, served your time. Thank you for your service. You definitely made me a lot of money. Here's some land for you to get started. And then that's like your starter pack. So if you're being dropped in a survival video game, here's your starter kit. Go ahead and get started. Have fun not dying from dysentery, pooping your brains out. So the indentured servants, they were able to recruit a couple people, but the numbers are going to be typically low early on. Many of the wealthy people who can afford to bring over these indentured servants, because there are people that want to come over to get a new life, typically the losers, we'll call them, from the old world. The wealthy people don't necessarily want to invest in this because it's expensive. You have to pay for this guy's month-long boat ride across the Atlantic Ocean. You have to feed him and clothe him and then give him stuff when he leaves. And so early on, people aren't really thrilled about investing all this money, especially think back to the mortality rate when these indentured servants very well could just die a couple months into being in the new world from malaria, dysentery, or being murdered by a Native American, or who knows what, maybe mauled by a bear. Who knows? Crazy stuff happens. So the colonists start to develop this system that's called the headright system. The headright system is the idea that for people to bring over indentured servants to help with this labor crisis, they'll be incentivized, the contractors will be incentivized with an extra bit of land from the provincial government. So here's a definition of the headright system. System to encourage the importation of indentured servants by giving masters the rights to 50 acres of land per servant. So if you're a wealthy dude, you want more land, pay for this scrub to come over from England, and here's 50 free acres that you can then invest in, grow tobacco in, do what you want. And then with the money you make from that, maybe you bring over another servant and get another 50 acres of land. And so this system is really going to benefit the masters because not only are they getting some labor that hopefully survives long enough to be worth the investment, but they're also getting 50 acres of land, which is a pretty substantial chunk. And this land belongs to the master and their family, to the contractor. And over time, these contractors, these wealthy people who are able to afford to bring people over, are going to accumulate massive plantations and properties of their own just from bringing people over. And again, as they have more land, they can make more money off that land. They can bring over more servants, you get more and more land. And then over time, this is where a lot of the huge stereotypical plantations from when we get closer to the Civil War era, you might be familiar with some of those, movies like Django Unchained or Free State of Jones, for example, or some of the movies that cover these, but you have these huge plantations. Well, the headright system is going to do a lot to get these early people started. Some like the First Families of Virginia, the FFVs. This is where a lot of them get their start. By 1700, these white slaves, that's one of the terms that is often used for the indentured servants, because, yeah, they're contracted, they're legally property of the master. So we usually consider them white slaves. They're going to account for more than 3/4 of all European immigrants to Virginia. So most of the people coming over, most of these immigrants are going to be contracted labor, making their way to the new world for a better life for themselves if they live long enough and do a good enough job to finish their contract. White slaves can be really deceiving. Even though they were contracted, even though they were kind of the property of their masters, they still retain several rights that later on, when we get to the chattel slavery and the African slavery, that's going to really leave a stain on the United States history. Those are going to be night and day differences in regards to how the slaves are treated and what their rights really are. So don't get too invested in the white slave phrase. There's a layer of truth to it, but we don't want to really take that to heart too much. So over time, the masters that are accumulating these huge properties, they start to get a little greedy or a little stingy with the freedom dues, and they're going to be giving out less and less land because land equals money and power, because you can do stuff with that land to make money. And so these indentured servants who are then freed without land start to just roam the countryside as a bunch of vagabonds, unemployed people, kind of in a similar situation that they were in England when they didn't have jobs and didn't have land of their own. These are mostly young, single, landless males. And if there's one thing that's really dangerous when it comes to revolutions or civil unrest is when you have a bunch of young, single, frustrated, landless males who feel that they are wrong. So foreshadowing, this is going to be a bit of a problem. They're disappointed for two reasons here. One is that they don't have any land to work on their own, so they're unemployed. And there aren't any women around for them to settle down, have a family, and have something to invest in. So there's a lot of frustration here, a lot of hopelessness for these people, and they're going to look to the local government for assistance. The governor at the time in Virginia is a guy named William Berkeley. William Berkeley is trying to walk a tightrope between keeping the Native Americans, or keeping peace with the Native Americans, and maintaining civility among the colonists. Many of the, and this is for some pretty simple reasons. Berkeley does not want conflict with the Native Americans because conflict is bad for people's health. It's also bad for the economy, and it's bad for the colonists who are still not entirely settled. Like, they're pretty well settled, they're pretty well established, but things can go wrong and force them out if the Native Americans get enough momentum to drive them out. So Berkeley is ultimately trying to keep the peace, to make sure that most people are happy and life can go on as usual. And these freemen look to Berkeley and his friendly Native American policies as ultimately like treason to the colonists themselves, because they want land. And if the Native Americans have land, Berkeley is the one keeping the colonists from taking land from the Native Americans. So Bacon, a fellow named Nathaniel Bacon, one of these young, unmarried, landless males wandering the countryside, frustrated with the way things are, he and his fellow indentured servants start to see Berkeley as part of the problem. That if Berkeley were to ease up on his pro-Native American policies and let the freemen go out and take land by force, things might be better off for the indentured servants. So Bacon and about 1,000 of these other freemen are going to initiate a rebellion against Berkeley and the government of Virginia, and this is going to become Bacon's Rebellion. Bacon's Rebellion, not as well known as it probably should be, but there are going to be some long-lasting consequences from Bacon's Rebellion. So Bacon's Rebellion, the rebels attack Native American tribes. They're even going to chase Berkeley out of Jamestown and torch the Capitol. So they do have early success in regards to rebellion. It's a pretty good start, burning down the Capitol. Sure, why not? I mean, I don't approve of that behavior personally, but hey, if you're going to have a rebellion, that's probably a good way to do it. Bacon's Rebellion is going to continue until Bacon himself dies of diseases, because again, diseases suck. Berkeley is then going to crush the rebellion and hang more than 20 rebels. So Berkeley is pretty ruthless in his revenge. But ultimately, the rebellion fails. As a result, the elites are going to begin looking to a different source of labor due to a fear of another rebellion. Because they're seeing this and they're like, okay, we had 1,000 dudes who didn't get land from their masters. They were a problem. If we keep getting indentured servants and we don't give them land, we're going to have another problem. But I don't want to give up my land to these dudes, so we need to look for another source of labor. Sorry, I'm flipping the next slide. And the conclusion that they're going to come to is we need to start transitioning to chattel slavery and African slavery. And there's a couple reasons that the African slaves are going to be so appealing. If we looked at the Native American labor force, the ones that just kept running away or dying from European diseases, the African slaves, Africans in general, have had more exposure to Europeans than the Native Americans have for hundreds of years. The Portuguese were exploring the west coast of Africa throughout the 15th century, so throughout the 1400s. And so by the time we get to 1670 or so with Bacon's Rebellion, 1676, the Africans had almost, let's say about 250 years of exposure to European diseases. So it gives them a higher level of resistance than the Native Americans, who are still dropping like flies in Virginia. Because again, 1607, 1670, it's about 60 years, so not nearly as long to build up a resistance to the European diseases. So the Africans have a greater resistance to European diseases. Also, if you take the Africans and bring them to the New World, they don't know the languages of the local people. They don't know the geography. They don't have connections. They don't have friends and family and neighboring tribes like the Native Americans would. So if the Africans try to run away, they're going to have a really hard time surviving on their own in an unknown place with unknown languages. And also it's going to be pretty easy to spot them and catch them because of the color of their skin, unfortunately. This would be comparable to, if I took one of you Rappahannock students and dropped you into Hong Kong, drop you in an urban environment. I don't know how many of you speak the local dialect of Hong Kong, but if you do, you might be okay. But if not, you're going to be in a lot of trouble. And so that's going to be really appealing in that regard as well, because they're isolated and they have resistance to diseases. So this is the main consequence, here we go. The main consequence of Bacon's rebellion for us, even though the rebellion failed, it's going to wake up the masters, the wealthy landowners, that the indentured servants were not working out. And they're going to start to transition to African slaves. That's going to lead us closer and closer to some of the conflict that's going to lead us to the American Civil War. And we'll pick back up on slavery on another day. So check on learning. Here are the questions that I want you guys to think about and respond to in Canvas. This information is findable in the chapter. I've also been talking about these things here in the video. So if you need to go back to fill in your notes to make sure you have some of the key things I need you to know, by all means, go back through the video and jot down some notes and submit those on Canvas for me. First question, what caused the high mortality rate for English colonists in the New World during the beginning of the 17th century? Second question, who were the two parties involved in an indentured servant contract and what did each get out of the deal? And 3, what was Bacon's rebellion? Oh, don't mind my typo. What was Bacon's rebellion and how did Bacon's rebellion motivate landowners to look for another source of cheap labor in the English colonies? Hopefully we'll talk about these in class and we'll be able to have a good discussion reviewing this lesson on early colonial life, especially in regards to like the economic, social, and political relationships between these groups. Other than that, I think I'm out of things to talk about for this lesson. I'm going to try to keep it short. I know I've already gone over 20 minutes, so I apologize. Hopefully you guys are using the little buttons on the bottom of the YouTube page to make me talk faster like a little chipmunk to save yourself some time so long as you can still understand what I'm saying. So I'm going to go ahead and sign off. I'll see you guys in class. Email me if you guys have any questions, and we'll go from there. Too easy. Mr. Long, over and out.